In the soft hour before dusk, the drawing-room of Alderwick House glimmered with borrowed gentility. Beeswax candles stood straight as sentries upon the mantel, their flames trembling whenever the door opened, while the fire whispered behind its grate, lending warmth that could not disguise the room's careful economy. China cups, thin as eggshells and twice as fragile in spirit, were set upon the tables with deliberate precision. Everything spoke of effort, of restraint, of a household balancing pride upon a narrowing edge. Miss Eleanor Ashcombe entered quietly as she always did when guests were present. She wore the gown she had chosen that morning with unwavering resolve. Muslin long past its fashionable hour, its hue a pale gray that once aspired to blue, its trim modest to the point of apology. The bodice fit well enough, though it had been altered by her own hand, stitches neat and invisible like her intentions. It was not negligence that guided her choice but strategy. Tonight was not for hope. Tonight was for survival. Her father stood near the hearth, speaking with the practiced civility of a man accustomed to better rooms than this one. Mr. Ashcombe's hair had gone thin at the temples, and the line between his brows had deepened with each season that failed to restore the family's fortunes. He had invited neighbors of consequence, landowners, magistrates' wives, distant relations whose approval still carried weight, not to advance his daughter but to protect her. In a world governed by dowries and display, invisibility could be mercy. Eleanor felt the first prickle of attention the moment she crossed the threshold. It came not as open rudeness, but as a slight hesitation in conversation, a pause where eyes measured and dismissed. A lady in a rose-colored gown glanced down at Eleanor's hem, then quickly away as though the sight were contagious. Another murmured something behind her fan, lips curved in a smile that never reached the eyes. Eleanor received these small injuries with practiced composure, inclining her head, offering polite greetings, placing herself near the window where the light was kindest and the scrutiny least severe. She had learned early that dignity was not loud. It did not demand redress. It endured. Tea was poured. Cards were brought out. The familiar choreography of polite society unfolded with its usual predictability. Eleanor spoke when spoken to, answered with intelligence carefully softened by humility, and never lingered too long in any company. Each movement was deliberate, each silence chosen. Her gown did its work well. She saw how expectations slipped away from her like loosened knots, how ambition redirected itself elsewhere. Relief and regret moved through her in equal measure. It was during one such moment, when she stood alone, gazing out at the darkening lawn, that memory intruded upon her composure. She had not intended to think of him tonight. Yet the mind, ungovernable as weather, brought him forth with painful clarity. A duke, distant by both rank and temperament, whom she had met briefly during a prior season. He had spoken little but listened well. He had treated her opinions as worthy of reply. She had admired him quietly, hopelessly, loving without expectation, until prudence demanded she put such thoughts aside. He had returned to his estates. Life had continued. A soft laugh rose behind her, followed by the rustle of silk. Eleanor turned, offered a courteous smile, and returned to her practiced calm. If there was a faint ache beneath it, she kept it well hidden. This evening was not about what might have been. It was about ensuring there would be no cruel speculation tomorrow, no whispers that could not be undone. Then the door opened again. The servant's voice carried across the room, announcing a name spoken with careful respect. Conversation faltered. Chairs stilled. Even the fire seemed to pause in its murmuring. Eleanor did not look at once. She had learned that curiosity too quickly indulged could betray one's hopes. Instead, she felt the shift before she saw it, the subtle straightening of spines, the recalibration of smiles, the quiet acknowledgement of altered stakes. When at last she turned, the world appeared momentarily unbalanced. He stood just within the threshold, unadorned by flourish, his expression composed, his presence unmistakable. The Duke she had once loved without witness or reward had entered her father's drawing room, and in that instant, Eleanor understood the true peril of having chosen to be unseen. The room resumed its breath with careful artifice. Polite exclamations followed, voices pitched just high enough to sound untroubled. Eleanor felt the heat rise along her neck, not from vanity, but from the sudden fear of being known too well. She lowered her gaze, fingers clasped lightly before her, willing herself back into the safety of obscurity. Yet awareness pressed upon her, undeniable, as though his attention had weight and temperature. Across the room, the Duke inclined his head in greeting to her father, manners impeccable, expression reserved. He did not look at Eleanor immediately. That restraint, once familiar, struck her now with renewed force. It had been the same years ago, his courtesy never careless, his interest never announced. It was what had made her love him silently, and what made the present moment so dangerous. She could not bear to be misread, nor to be remembered. A lady nearby began to speak of weather and roads, filling the air with safe observations. Eleanor seized upon the sound, anchoring herself to the ordinary. She reminded herself that a single glance did not alter reality, that rank and fortune were not softened by memory. Still, her pulse betrayed her calm. The gown she wore, chosen to erase her, now felt perilously thin, as though it might reveal more than cloth ever should. At last she sensed his gaze. It did not skim or dismiss. It rested. Eleanor lifted her eyes, and for one unguarded second the room fell away. Recognition passed between them, quiet and exact. He saw her and would remember. He did not approach her at once. That restraint, so characteristic of him, shaped the evening more than any bold declaration might have done. Instead, he moved through the room with quiet assurance, offering measured greetings, listening more than he spoke, his presence altering the atmosphere as surely as a change in weather. Eleanor felt it keenly, that subtle rearrangement of attention, as though the room itself had tilted imperceptibly in his direction. She took refuge in small tasks. Cups needed clearing. A chair required adjustment. Each motion gave her purpose and distance. Yet she was acutely aware of him in her periphery, noting how others angled themselves toward his notice, how smiles grew brighter, voices lighter. He belonged to a world that prized ease and command, while she stood deliberately outside its reach, her plain gown a quiet declaration of boundaries. When at last he spoke to her, it was not abrupt. He waited until a natural pause opened between conversations, then addressed her with the courtesy due a lady, no more, no less. "Miss Ashcombe," he said, inclining his head, his tone even, as though years had not passed since they last stood within the same room. The sound of her name upon his lips unsettled her more than she expected. "Your Grace," she replied, meeting his gaze briefly before lowering her eyes. The exchange was brief, decorous, observed. Yet something in his attention lingered, as though he had noted not only her words, but the care with which she had chosen them. Eleanor felt a strange tightening in her chest, an awareness that she was being seen with a clarity she had hoped to avoid. They were drawn into a small circle near the card table, conversation turning upon books, the weather, a recent sermon that had stirred mild debate. Eleanor spoke once, offering a thoughtful remark softened by modest phrasing. The Duke listened with the same intent expression she remembered, his focus undivided. When another interrupted, he did not turn away from her at once, and that hesitation did not go unnoticed. Whispers followed. Eleanor sensed them like a draft along the floorboards. Why should he attend to her? What merit lay beneath that faded gown? She felt the familiar urge to retreat, to make herself smaller, yet something steadied her resolve. She had chosen her place this evening. She would not flee it. Later, when the card games dispersed and conversation fractured into quieter threads, a footman approached her with a small parcel. It was wrapped in plain paper, tied with string, unmarked. Eleanor hesitated before accepting it, aware of the curious glances cast her way. The servant murmured that it had been left with instructions to deliver it to her hand alone. She waited until she stood once more by the window before untying the string. Inside lay a slim volume, its leather worn soft with use. She recognized the title at once, a collection of essays she had once mentioned in passing years ago, when she believed her words would vanish as soon as they were spoken. No note accompanied it. None was required. The gift unsettled her more deeply than any public gesture might have done. It spoke of memory, of attention paid without expectation of return. Eleanor closed the book carefully as though it were something alive, and pressed it against her palm, grounding herself in its weight. Across the room, the Duke observed her with the same quiet reserve. He did not smile. He did not approach. Yet his gaze held a question, unspoken and deliberate. Eleanor felt her carefully constructed defenses strain beneath it. Time itself seemed to draw thin around her, stretched by anticipation and dread. She wondered what it meant to be remembered after years of deliberate obscurity, and whether such remembrance was gift or danger. In a society that measured women by visible worth, his attention threatened to expose her careful humility, inviting scrutiny she had labored to avoid. Still, beneath the unease stirred a fragile warmth, a reminder that she had once been valued for her mind, her steadiness, her quiet courage. Her father lingered nearby, his presence a silent warning. Eleanor sensed his concern without needing it voiced, the weight of parental vigilance pressing gently but firmly. She loved him for that care, even as it bound her to caution, reminding her that affection, once noticed, carried responsibilities she had never dared imagine. A sense of inevitability settled over her, faint yet insistent, as though events had begun moving beyond her careful control, guided by another will entirely. Her father joined her soon after, his expression courteous yet taut. He spoke softly, caution threading his words. Such attention could invite speculation. Kindness, once misinterpreted, could harden into scandal. Eleanor understood the risk. She had lived long enough in society's margins to recognize how swiftly favor could turn to censure. Still, beneath her obedience lay a flicker of resolve, a quiet certainty that dignity did not require disappearance, only courage. As the evening waned, guests began to depart, cloaks gathered, farewells exchanged. Eleanor remained near the door, offering polite goodbyes, her mind racing ahead to consequences yet unseen. She felt suspended between fear and something dangerously like hope, aware that the careful order of her life had shifted, however slightly, upon its axis. When at last the Duke took his leave, he paused before her, his presence commanding the moment without overt claim. His eyes rested upon her gown, not in judgment but comprehension, as though he understood the choice it represented and the cost it carried. The knowledge unsettled her more than admiration ever could. "I am pleased to have found you unchanged," he said, the words measured, their meaning anything but simple. Before she could reply, he inclined his head and was gone, leaving Eleanor standing in the threshold, the book warm against her hand, her resolve shaken, and the growing certainty that invisibility, once her refuge, might soon become her greatest peril. The rain began without warning, a fine silver veil that softened the garden paths and pressed the evening into stillness. Eleanor stood beneath the shelter of the covered walk, the stone cool at her back, the scent of damp earth rising to meet her breath. She had come here seeking composure, a place where her thoughts might settle after the strain of the previous evening, yet the quiet only sharpened her awareness of all that had been set in motion. She heard him before she saw him, the measured sound of footsteps upon gravel, unhurried, deliberate. Her heart faltered, then steadied itself through habit rather than courage. She did not turn at once. The discipline she had cultivated demanded restraint even now, when every instinct urged her to flee or face him fully. "Miss Ashcombe," he said, his voice carrying easily through the softened air. She turned then, inclining her head in greeting. The Duke stood several paces away, his coat darkened by rain, his expression grave yet attentive. There was no audience here, no circle of polite observers to temper what might pass between them. Eleanor felt the weight of that privacy settle upon her like a held breath. "Your Grace," she replied, careful to keep her tone even. "You should not linger in such weather." "I wish to speak with you," he answered simply, as though the desire itself required no embellishment. They stood in silence for a moment, the rain threading softly between them. Eleanor clasped her hands before her, aware of how small gestures assumed great importance in such circumstances. She wondered if he had come to explain the gift or to retract it, or to satisfy a curiosity he would soon regret indulging. Each possibility carried its own quiet peril. "At your gathering," he began, his gaze steady, "I recognized something I should have acknowledged long ago." Her breath caught, though she willed herself stillness. "Recognition can be dangerous," she said gently, the truth of it born from long experience. "So I have learned," he replied. "Yet danger is not always a reason for silence." Eleanor lifted her eyes then, meeting his. There was no urgency in his expression, no reckless warmth. What she saw instead was consideration tempered by resolve. It unsettled her more deeply than ardor ever could. "You chose your dress with care," he continued, his words precise. "Not to draw attention but to deflect it." She felt the heat rise beneath her composure, though she did not look away. "It is sometimes wise," she said, "to leave nothing for speculation." "And yet," he said softly, "it invites another sort of question." She hesitated, then answered with honesty rather than defense. "I have little to offer society's expectations. I sought to spare my father, and myself, their scrutiny." He nodded once as though confirming something already understood. "You have always valued substance over display." The simplicity of the statement undid her. Eleanor felt something loosen within her, a knot she had carried so long it seemed part of her very nature. She looked away, fixing her gaze upon the rain-washed hedges, unwilling to risk the exposure of her expression. "Your Grace," she said after a moment, "whatever kindness you intend, I must ask you to consider its consequences." "I have," he replied. "That is why I speak to you here and not before others." The space between them felt suddenly charged, the air thick with restraint. Eleanor sensed the edge of something momentous approaching, not as a rush, but as an inevitable turning. "I admired you once," she said quietly, surprising herself with the confession. "I did not expect it to be returned, nor did I hope it would be." His stillness deepened, as though he feared any movement might disturb her resolve. "I did not know," he said. "I ensured you would not," she answered, her voice steady, her heart anything but. "Affection unacknowledged is safer than affection observed." He considered her words with care. "And yet it does not cease to exist simply because it is hidden." "No," she agreed, "but it learns to endure." They stood thus, bound by candor and caution, the rain bearing witness to a truth neither had named aloud until now. Eleanor felt the weight of her own honesty, both liberating and terrifying. She had stepped beyond the shelter of obscurity, and there was no returning unchanged. "I will not compromise your dignity," he said at last, the promise implicit rather than spoken. "Nor will I act without honor." She turned to him then, searching his face. "Honor alone cannot shield us," she said. "Society is less forgiving than we might wish." "I am aware," he replied. "Which is why I intend to proceed with care, if you will permit it." The request, framed as it was, struck her with unexpected force. Not permission for affection but for consideration. For acknowledgement without presumption. Eleanor felt a quiet shift within herself, a rebalancing she could neither deny nor fully comprehend. "I ask nothing beyond respect," she said, her voice scarcely more than breath. "And I offer nothing less," he returned. The rain began to ease, thinning to a mist that caught the fading light. Eleanor realized she had not felt the cold, nor the damp, only the steady presence of a man who saw her not as she had concealed herself, but as she was. It was a recognition both tender and perilous. As he inclined his head in farewell, stepping back to restore the distance propriety demanded, she felt the absence keenly, even before he turned away. She stood alone once more beneath the covered walk, the echo of his words lingering like a held note, and understood that the careful boundaries she had drawn around her life had begun, quietly and irrevocably, to yield. The days that followed unfolded with deceptive calm, as though the world itself conspired to disguise the magnitude of what had begun. Eleanor moved through her routines with practiced composure, yet every familiar act carried a subtle alteration, as if the ground beneath her feet had shifted by a fraction too small to see and too great to ignore. She read in the mornings, walked the gardens when weather permitted, and assisted her father with correspondence, all while sensing that each moment was suspended between what had been and what must inevitably follow. Word traveled swiftly even without spectacle. It did not arrive as accusation but as curiosity. A neighbor inquired after the Duke's health with unusual interest. A distant cousin wrote requesting confirmation of his visit, phrasing the question with an excess of politeness that betrayed intent. Eleanor recognized these signs for what they were: society testing the ground, gauging whether rumor would find purchase. She understood the danger not in overt scandal, but in suggestion, which once seated could not easily be undone. Her father observed her with renewed attention, concern etched more deeply upon his features. He did not question her directly. Instead, he asked whether she felt equal to receiving callers, whether she preferred to postpone a planned visit, whether she wished to send her apologies where once she would have attended without thought. His restraint was an act of love, yet it weighed upon her nonetheless. Eleanor knew he feared not impropriety but disappointment, the kind that could not be softened by time. It was during one such afternoon, as light filtered thinly through cloud and glass, that a carriage drew up before the house with unmistakable authority. Eleanor felt it before she saw it, a tightening in her chest that stole her breath for a moment. The footman announced the Duke's arrival with careful emphasis, and the household seemed to pause in collective awareness of what that presence implied. He did not ask for privacy. He did not linger in the hall. He was shown into the modest sitting room where Eleanor and her father waited, and there he stood, composed, his bearing neither apologetic nor presumptive. Eleanor noted with a strange clarity that he wore no excessive ornament, that his attire spoke of intention rather than display. It was a detail that steadied her. "Mr. Ashcombe," he said, inclining his head with measured respect. "Miss Ashcombe." Her father rose at once, surprise quickly masked by courtesy. Eleanor followed, hands clasped before her, her posture betraying nothing of the turmoil beneath. "I trust you will forgive the informality of my visit," the Duke continued. "I wish to speak plainly and without delay." There was a moment, brief yet charged, in which Eleanor felt the weight of his words settle into the room. Her father gestured for him to sit, though his own expression remained guarded, as though bracing for a truth long anticipated. "I am aware," the Duke said once they were seated, "that my presence at your recent gathering may have occasioned comment. It was not my intention to invite speculation without purpose." Eleanor's gaze remained lowered, though every word resonated within her with painful clarity. "I have known your daughter for some years," he continued, his voice steady, deliberate. "I have admired her character, her intelligence, and her sense of principle. I regret that I did not sooner give voice to that admiration." Her father listened in silence, his attention unwavering. Eleanor sensed his effort to maintain composure, to measure the moment with fairness rather than hope. "It is my intention," the Duke said, "to request your consent to a formal understanding, conducted with propriety and regard for your family's circumstances." The words fell into the room with quiet force. Eleanor felt as though the air had been displaced, leaving her momentarily unmoored. She dared not look up, fearing that her expression would betray too much or too little. Her father did not reply at once. He leaned back slightly, his fingers steepled, the lines of his face deepened by thought rather than age alone. "Your Grace," he said at last, "you will forgive my frankness when I say that my daughter has no fortune to recommend her. I would not see her made the subject of charity, however kindly intended." The Duke inclined his head, acknowledging the concern without defensiveness. "Nor would I," he said. "I do not offer generosity. I offer partnership." Eleanor's breath caught, though she remained still. "I seek no advantage in disparity," he continued. "I am prepared to settle matters in such a way as to preserve your daughter's independence and dignity, now and in the future." Her father studied him closely, as though searching for any hint of condescension or indulgence. Finding none, his expression softened by degrees, though caution remained. "You speak with conviction," he said. "Yet society is seldom so measured." "I am aware," the Duke replied. "Which is why I wish to proceed with clarity, not haste." Eleanor lifted her eyes then, drawn by the steadiness of his tone. Their gazes met, and for a moment the room seemed to recede, leaving only the knowledge that something irrevocable had been acknowledged between them. Her father rose and moved toward the window, a gesture of reflection rather than retreat. He stood there for a long moment, his back to them, the landscape beyond offering no counsel. Eleanor felt the tension stretch thin, her own resolve tested by silence. When he turned at last, his eyes held both concern and reluctant hope. "If my daughter consents," he said slowly, "I will not stand in the way of her happiness. But I will not permit her to be exposed to cruelty under the guise of privilege." The Duke rose at once. "On that," he said, "we are entirely agreed." All eyes turned to Eleanor. She felt the weight of expectation press upon her, not as command but as opportunity. She understood, with a clarity that startled her, that silence now would not preserve her safety, only her solitude. "I consent," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath, "with the understanding that my worth is not to be measured by what I lack." The Duke regarded her with an expression that held no triumph, only resolve. "It never has been," he said. The visit concluded without ceremony. No declarations were made, no assurances offered beyond those already spoken. Yet when the carriage departed and the house returned to its familiar stillness, Eleanor felt the echo of that conversation linger like a held note, resonant and unresolved. Later that evening, as dusk settled and lamps were lit, Eleanor stood alone in her chamber, the window open to the cooling air. She pressed her hand against the glass, grounding herself in its chill. She had stepped beyond the refuge of obscurity into something far more perilous, visibility tempered by choice. Below, in the gathering dark, she glimpsed the road stretching away, uncertain and irrevocably altered, and understood that whatever awaited her now would demand not retreat, but courage equal to love. Morning arrived without ceremony, pale and deliberate, as though the world wished to proceed gently now that something irrevocable had been set in motion. Eleanor rose early, her thoughts already awake, arranged not in confusion but in careful order. The certainty of the previous days had settled into her bones, not as triumph but as resolve. She moved through the house quietly, aware that every familiar surface now bore a new meaning, as if the walls themselves had witnessed her transformation and chosen to hold it in confidence. Society did not wait long to respond. Letters arrived with increasing frequency, each phrased with exaggerated politeness, each seeking confirmation without daring to ask directly. Invitations were extended and withdrawn with equal haste. Eleanor observed these shifts with an acuity born of long practice. She had lived too long at the margins to mistake curiosity for kindness, yet she sensed something different now. Where once there had been dismissal, there was calculation. Where there had been silence, there was restraint. The knowledge that the Duke had acted openly, honorably, had altered the tone of every whisper. He did not press his presence upon her. That restraint remained his defining feature, and Eleanor came to rely upon it more than she would have trusted Ardor. Their correspondence was sparse but deliberate, letters composed with care, their language precise, their sentiment unmistakable. He wrote not of possession but of partnership, not of conquest but of patience. Each page affirmed what his actions had already declared, that she was not a cause to be championed, but a woman to be respected. When at last he returned, it was not amid spectacle, but beneath a sky brushed clean by rain. The carriage halted at a modest distance, as though even arrival must be governed by propriety. Eleanor met him in the garden, where winter's approach had stripped the branches bare, leaving honesty where ornament once prevailed. She wore a gown of simple cut, neither old nor ostentatious, chosen not to conceal herself, but to stand unguarded. They walked slowly, their steps aligned without effort. No declarations passed between them, for none were required. Instead, they spoke of small things: the condition of the road, the weather's persistence, a book she had recently finished. Yet beneath each measured exchange ran an undercurrent of shared understanding, a recognition that their bond had been forged not in defiance of society, but in clear-eyed acknowledgment of its weight. "I will not promise you ease," he said at length, stopping beside a stone bench worn smooth by time. "There will be those who will never forgive what they perceive as imbalance." Eleanor considered his words with the same honesty that had guided her thus far. "I have lived with imbalance all my life," she replied. "What I will not endure is diminution." He regarded her then with quiet intensity. "Nor shall you," he said. "Not by me." It was not a vow spoken before witnesses, nor sealed by ceremony, yet Eleanor felt its truth settle within her with a steadiness she had never known. She understood then that love need not be loud to be enduring, that it could exist within constraint without surrendering its power. The arrangements that followed were conducted with equal care. Her father was consulted, his concerns addressed without dismissal or indulgence. Settlements were drawn not to erase disparity, but to render it irrelevant. Eleanor's independence was not merely preserved, but acknowledged as integral to the union. She observed these proceedings not as a passive beneficiary, but as a participant, her voice heard and heeded. It was a distinction she did not take lightly. The day of the ceremony dawned clear and cold, the air sharp with promise. There was no grand assembly, no procession of curious onlookers. The church stood quiet, its stone walls bearing the weight of countless vows, each spoken with hope and fear in equal measure. Eleanor arrived without escort, her steps measured, her heart composed. She wore a gown of understated elegance, its fabric unadorned, its lines honest. It was not the finest she could have worn, nor the plainest. It was simply hers. He waited within, his expression calm, his posture attentive. When their eyes met, there was no surprise in either gaze, only recognition. The vows were spoken with clarity, each word deliberate, each promise grounded not in illusion but in choice. Eleanor felt the gravity of the moment not as burden, but as confirmation. She was not being elevated nor rescued. She was being joined. Afterward, there were no celebrations to impress the world, only a quiet gathering of those whose presence carried meaning rather than obligation. Conversation flowed easily, unmarked by scrutiny. Eleanor moved among them with a confidence that startled even herself, aware that the eyes upon her now sought understanding rather than fault. She felt neither vindicated nor triumphant, only whole. As afternoon gave way to evening, she found herself alone once more, standing at the threshold of her former home. The rooms behind her held the echoes of a life defined by careful restraint, by dignity maintained through absence. She did not mourn that life, nor did she dismiss it. It had shaped her, tempered her, taught her the value of silence and the cost of invisibility. She carried it with her now, not as armor but as memory. He joined her without announcement, standing beside her as the light shifted, casting long shadows across the floor. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice gentle. She considered the question, understanding its depth. Readiness was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to move forward regardless of it. Eleanor smiled then, a gesture unguarded and sincere. "I am," she said. They departed together, not into uncertainty but into intention. The road ahead was not promised to be smooth, yet it was chosen, and that distinction mattered more than any assurance of ease. Eleanor felt the weight of her name change not as erasure, but as expansion, a recognition that she had not been diminished by union but strengthened through it. Later, when night had settled and the world had narrowed to firelight and quiet, Eleanor stood at a window once more, much as she had on the evening when everything first began to shift. The reflection she saw now was familiar, yet altered. She was the same woman who had chosen her worst dress to protect her dignity, who had believed obscurity her safest refuge. Yet she had learned that dignity did not require disappearance, only the courage to be seen on one's own terms. Behind her, the house breathed softly, its walls holding new memories, untested and waiting. Eleanor rested her hand against the glass, not in uncertainty but in resolve. She knew now that love, when grounded in respect, did not demand sacrifice of self, only the surrender of fear. And as she turned from the window toward the life unfolding behind her, she understood that the world had not changed but she had, and that was enough.